I wish I could be with you in person, and thank you for recording it. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about some of the work that we've done on the ability to remember the past, hence memory, and use those experiential memories of the past to imagine and importantly plan for the future, and how we think that magic effects might help us understand these things further. Because magic effects are very good at looking at the blind spots in seeing and the roadblocks in thinking, and therefore they're a good way of non-verbally alerting us to constraints in cognition in general.
But is this just another example of instinctive behaviour to survive the winter? Or
this is what my birds do for a living. It's called food caching.
It's a question that's greatly intrigued Professor Nicola Clayton. Just remember where they buried food in the past.
If they can travel back in their mind's eye to think about the past, can they also travel forward in the mind's eye to think about the future? Can they imagine the future, if you like? Can they plan it?
Daily routine for almost a week.
So we give them 3 lots of experiences of waking up in the hungry room and 3 lots of experiences of waking up in the room that serves breakfast. But the important point is that the birds themselves didn't know which room they'd end up in on any given day.
But then Nikki changed the test. She allowed the birds to cache food. It's very rare in the animal kingdom, and it's the 4th key ability needed to solve problems.
It's called mental time travel.
So that gives you a feeling for some of the kinds of experiments we've conducted on the jays and other members of the corvid family, crows, ravens, magpies, rooks, to look at how they remember the past and how they plan for the future. And it also shows you something about what our experiments look like at Madingley at the University of Cambridge. We argued that actually magic effects, as I mentioned at the outset, might be really informative about cognition in animals because it's a very visual, largely acoustic to some extent, but mainly visual way and a non-verbal way of looking at constraints, at these blind spots in thinking and roadblocks in seeing. And we thought that the jays would be a particularly good candidate for these investigations because not only do they seem really good at remembering the past and planning the future, the experiments I showed you in the little video that we made there with the BBC television broadcasters, the results of the experiments were published in a series of papers in Nature and Science. But of course, because these birds hide food and go to great lengths to protect their caches from other individuals, it's also deceptive. And we've argued that actually some of the ways in which they protect their caches from being stolen by other individuals have a number of interesting similarities with some of the tricks that magicians use. So, for example, they use shade to degrade information. Well, magicians do that too. They use barriers to obscure the observer's view. They use distance, and they keep track of their audience just as magicians do. In this case, in the case of the jays, keeping track of not only who was watching when they hid their food, but who was listening. So when others can hear but cannot see, the jays are as quiet as a mouse, and they cache the food in places that make the least possible noise. And also they minimize their own vocalizations to make it much less likely that others will know that they are hiding behind a barrier and therefore can access some information even if it isn't visual, even if it's not information they can see. And perhaps the most striking example of the flexibility of these birds under these circumstances is in the following experiment, which my husband Nathan Emery and I conducted, where we asked whether if the birds were watched at the time of caching, would they move them to new places when the potential pilferers, the possible thieves, had left the scene. And we found that if birds were observed at the time of caching, they would move them to new places, which by definition, when they're re-hiding them, they're in private, others cannot see. Whereas if they hid the caches in private, so nobody else could see, they left them where they were. But not all birds did this. It was only those who had had previous experience of stealing caches themselves. Naive birds who had no experience of stealing didn't do so. They just left most of the caches where they were. We also found that actually the way in which they re-hide or move or recache, same 3 different words to mean the same thing. It's just they've been cached and then they're moved, re-hidden, recached in different places. Looks different depending on whether they're doing it in private. We know what's going on because we can observe them through little tiny cameras. But the birds, there are no other birds present, and the birds don't know we're present because they're set up through a series of surveillance cameras. And here you can see what recaching in private, a load of worms from its cache site, and it's clearly visible in the beak, and it's easy to see where they're moved, and they're usually moved just from one place to one other place, so they're moved once. But that's not the case when other birds are watching. And here you can see it's moved multiple times, but it's very difficult to see whether the items have been moved or not, whether they've genuinely been moved from one place to another, or whether actually these are fake moves, sleight of beak, if you think by analogy with what a magician would do with sleight of hand, where an item appears to be moved from one hand to another, but maybe is still in the original hand. And of course, the jays, like magicians, have secret pockets. In the case of the jays, it's a throat pouch under here that they can stuff full of worms. So what I want to do now is to show you a little movie clip of how we've been using magic effects to study cognition in the jays. And this involves my dance partner, Clive Wilkins, who's a professional magician and a member of the Magic Circle, and one of my PhD students, Elias Garcia Pellegrin, who now has a permanent position in Singapore, and one of my postdocs, Alexandra Schnell, who works for the National Geographic these days and has an amazing film on the secrets of the octopus coming out on National Earth Day in April, so next month. So let me show you this video because I'm hoping this will show you kind of how we've combined magic effects with what the jays do and how we've used it to study their cognition.
Magic tricks are a fascinating window on our minds.
Indeed. Do I have anything behind my ear? I doubt it. Anything in my hand? Of course not, which means that this should be physically impossible.
They highlight gaps in our perception and attention, which magicians exploit to disguise what's in front of our eyes.
I suppose the coin would be just there. Thank you very much.
But what about other animals? Do they fall for the same tricks we do? Could their susceptibility to magic tricks highlight flaws in their perception? Or could an ability to be misled actually reveal kinds of intelligence we didn't know they had? How did you become interested in doing magic tricks for animals?
Well, I've always wanted to be a bird. I've always wanted to fly and move around 3-dimensionally and think like a bird. So that's how I got into science. But also through my passion for dance, I met Professor Clive Wilkins, who's artist in residence in the Department of Psychology, and he's a professional magician. And we both shared a great interest in memory and mental time travel through different perspectives, art and science.
I visited Cambridge University's Comparative Cognition Lab to see how the group are examining the mental abilities of jays using magic tricks.
Jays are extremely intelligent. We call them the feathered apes because they're on a cognitive par with the chimpanzees. And they're also very attentive. They really watch what you're doing. And so they became the perfect subject.
Elias Garcia Pellegrin spent months working with the birds in order to prepare for the experiments.
And one of the things that Eli was able to do was to train them to peck a thumb to ask them which hand they thought concealed the object he'd hidden.
This trick is known as a French drop.
Good job, baby.
The jays don't fall for it, but perhaps that's not surprising. When humans watch the trick, we assume that the left hand is grasping the worm.
Your brain uses shortcuts when you perceive these movements. It just goes, well, what's the most likely thing to happen? Well, the most likely thing to happen is that when this hand grabs an object, the most likely thing is for a completed transfer to occur. And that's where magicians are very good, because they are very good at seeing how to make a movement which is perceptive so unlike a real movement that the brain does not notice it. Even though there are particular kinematics that would tell you that this movement is fake, right? Like the tension. But you don't see that because you're just using the shortcuts in perception. However, birds don't need these expectations to survive because they do not have hands.
But the birds do fall for some other tricks.
Okay. Have a look. Where is it? Here. You're wrong. It's not.
On my visit, it wasn't just the birds being treated to a show.
Sam, do you remember the £10 note we talked about? Could I borrow it now?
Yes, I do.
Excellent. Thank you very much. What carefully?
When I watch this trick, I'm pleasantly surprised by the increase in my fortunes. But a similar trick was used to make the jays think their favourite snack had been replaced with a different one.
It's a £20 note.
Basically, what we did is that we chose Stuka, the waxworm in this case, we pretended to deposit it inside the cup, and then we turned the cups around. Then Stuka went in and chose to retrieve the cup where she saw we put the waxworm in. But in doing so, she found that magically the waxworm had transformed into a mealworm. And then we measured how long it took Stuka here, or any of the birds that we tested, to actually ingest, to eat the worm, okay? And we found that when we did this case at the value condition, so their first preferred item magically transformed into their less preferred item, they took way longer than when we did an up value condition. So their less preferred item in this case transformed into their most preferred item. Think about the magic effect that Clive did for you. Okay, you were happy because a £10 note became a £20 note. That's great, right? But what if Clive takes your £10 note and transforms it into a £5 note? It's not that happy anymore, right? You're not that willing to take that £5 note anymore. You want to give it back. You want Clive to transform it into a £10 note again, don't you? That's what happened here.
Are you doing any magic experiments with any other animals besides wolves?
We're hoping to do some magic effects with primates, and we're also excited about exploring some of these ideas with cephalopods, cuttlefish, octopus, squid.
You do get attached to these animals, especially when you spend a long time working with them. You notice their different personalities. Gone are the days of like scientists with white lab coats, not having any feelings for their subjects. We've learned too much about what's going on in their minds to just treat them as just banal subjects. Because these are not banal subjects. These animals can think, they can feel, they understand the past, the present, and the future. And I don't see any point for me not to treat them as such.
So that gives you a bit of a feel for the kind of ways in which we do these magic effects and how we're using them to explore constraints on cognition. So some of the empirical work. So the original paper was published in Science, and then the subsequent empirical work in Proceedings of the Natural Academy of Sciences, Current Biology, and Annual Reviews of Psychology. So I'll just give you a brief feel for kind of where we're going with these things. And I want to stop in plenty of time to allow you to ask me any questions. So here you can see Eli actually performing or starting to perform one of the effects on the jays. You can see from this image, but also from the video, that the birds are very well trained. They come in, they're kept in 30-meter long aviaries, so massive aviaries, but they're trained to come into their name. So if I call Romero, Stuka, Stoika, they come in. J-Lo, they come in, they recognise the sound that I make for their name and fly in, and it's a good way of making sure that they voluntarily want to contribute. So we never ever catch the birds up with a net unless the bird is very ill and it's purely for welfare grounds. For all our experiments, they come in if they want to play, and if they don't, we wait until they're ready to come in. So here you can see this is J-Lo, in fact, and she's been trained to choose one thumb, and she either pecks the left thumb and the contents are revealed, or the right thumb and the contents are revealed. And we did 3 kinds of magic effect. Eli is also a magician. He's not a member of the Magic Circle, but he's a very good amateur magician. So we did palm transfer, which requires an action in which this is done so that it goes from one hand to the other, and you actually use the thumb to secure the worm in the hand, or the French drop where it's held, that you don't really need a thumb and fingers to go very quickly across the area. And so here you can see, for example, Eli doing the palming technique. And you can see that J-Lo and the other J's are not fooled. And here you can see the French drop. And you can see that, again, she wasn't fooled. But here you see the fast pass. Yeah, it's gone. So what you see is that obviously percentage of correct responses, meaning at times they've been failed to be fooled by the magician, and they're very good at palm transfer and French drop, but they are fooled by the fast pass, the one where it's a very quick action like that doesn't involve any thumb actions of this or this kind of movement. So now what I want to do is show you another video that gives it a bit more detail. Oops, try and get that to work. This is showing you how we do it for people as well. So we compared the jays with humans, because we know that there are effects that magicians regularly use in performances to fool their audience. But the question was, if we showed it from exactly the same viewpoint as the jays. So this is what you're seeing what the people see compared with what the jays saw. So it's from the same perspective. So now your attention's drawn, and can you guess where it is? So this just shows the first one in the palm transfer one, where you're doing this action. And so on and so forth. And then there are various controls. I'll just show you one, which is where we ensure that we also make sure it's not just about whether it's in the left hand or the right hand, or whether it's been moved or not. So here you see the results. Basically, humans are fooled by all of them, even if they see them from the very same perspective as the jays. Same results as professional magicians get when they perform the effects in real life. So very low percentage of correct responses in all 3 conditions. So we argued that this is interesting because the Jays are fooled by some magic effects, but not others. And if you think about what magic really reveals, it's about having an expectation of what you think will happen next based on a memory of what you thought you saw happen in the past. And that expectation can be violated in clever ways by the magician. And that leads to that kind of, oh my God, how did you do that kind of response? We were saying, well, perhaps in some ways you think of Jays as being an unexpected audience because they're not humans. But on the other hand, if you think about the ways in which they hide food and the lengths with which they go to protect these caches of hidden food, they're using many of the same effects as humans are. But that led us to wonder why the Jays were fooled by the fast pass effect, but not by the palm transfer or the French drop. And we wondered at first whether it was something to do with the speed of vision, and that's why we introduced the fast pass effect, because things have moved very quickly, and we thought perhaps they wouldn't be fooled by that, but they were. But then I wondered whether it was something to do with embodiment, because as a dancer and choreographer in my other life, other than as a scientist, I'm well aware that the schema that we develop for our body heavily influences and shapes the way we think about our bodies and the way in which we can reenact certain movements. And so I wondered if essentially it was a wing thing, because the fast pass, the hand movements are like the way a wing moves. They're just like that. Whereas these other movements either depended on a pincer-like grip in the case of the French drop, or in the case of the first effect, it required an understanding that your thumb can move in that way and secure an item. And obviously feathers don't work like that. They can't do that or that kind of action. So we thought, well, it might be interesting to look at monkeys, because monkeys have hands, but some monkeys have opposable thumbs that do this action and other monkeys don't. So that led us on to monkey magic. And we compared 3 species of monkeys, marmosets that have hands, but they don't have opposable thumbs, capuchins that have opposable thumbs and use their opposable thumbs all the time in their interactions with the world, but in foraging and tool use, for example. And then the squirrel monkeys, which have semi-opposable thumbs. They can move the thumb a bit, but they can't really grip anything with the thumb. So I'll show you a little video of what we did and what we found. So it's this sharing of a biomechanical ability that I mean when I talk about embodied cognition, which dancers know very well, because the whole way in which you would move if you attempt to embody the body of a cephalopod, a cuttlefish or an octopus that has no vertebrae whatsoever, or a bird that has vertebrae but with hollow bones fundamentally affects the way in which it shapes your movement. And if you want to elongate your movement, you can imagine, for example, that your legs start not at your pelvis, but under your shoulder blade, and that allows you to create this longer extension of the movement. But we thought it was very interesting that these things don't just affect the movements themselves, but they affect the way in which you interpret what you think you saw and what you thought you remembered. So here are the results. So the precision grip that you use in the French drop that depends on opposable thumbs. Marmosets behave like jays. They're not fooled. They don't have opposable thumbs. Squirrel monkeys that have them, but they don't work very well, like capuchins who have opposable thumbs that work very well, are both fooled. But when we do our own invention of it, which requires this kind of grip, we call it power grip, that only needs fingers and not thumbs, the marmosets will fail too. So what I wanted to share with you today then is something about how memory is so subjective, or episodic like memories of what happened where and when, and how we experience them are subjective, but they influence not only how we think about the past, but how we make predictions and imagine when planning for the future. I've shown you how Jays are very good at these things, particularly within the realm of caching. Probably just that caching is such an easy paradigm for us to use to investigate these kind of processes, because they're caching for the future, but in order to get the benefit in the future, they have to have remembered what they cached in the past. But I've also interwoven magic to look at some of the blind spots in seeing and roadblocks in thinking, and shown you how actually for different species of animals with their different body types, for example, whether they've got fingers and thumbs on their hands or they've got wings instead, or whether if they have hands they've got opposable thumbs or not, fundamentally affects not only the way we move and interact with objects, but it also affects our interpretation of what we think we saw and what we think we remembered. So I just want to finish with how it might be very interesting, because there could also be cultural differences. This is a painting that one of my students beautifully drew for me of the three-legged crow, which is very, very influential in Asian mythology. In Japan, the three legs represent past, present, and future. And in China, and in the Chinese poem pictured here, it's all about hope for the future and new beginnings. And the crow was considered the only animal in their ancient mythology, their only non-human animal, that wasn't frightened of fire and would come and share the fires with their human compatriots, using the smoke from the fire to fumigate the wings. Then they would roost at night, and then in the morning, as dawn rose, they would fly off into the sunrise and become the golden crow. And that was all associated with how, with this wisdom, they didn't only treasure the past, but could imagine and plan for the future. And that was what was so crucial to their survival and ours. So with that, I'll finish. I'd like to thank all my collaborators, both my avian ones, my wonderful jays and rooks and New Caledonian crows, and the human members of my lab pictured here, including Clive doing his magic effects, and to thank you all for listening.